You're live.
Okay, everybody pay attention if you will. Okay, let's start with that. So this is kind of, yeah. This is kind of the beginning point we're making. This is sort of our evident truth. This is what I think is like our best case, if you will, for CA's independence, and as I've said, why it's important. I want to, emphasize that I'm going to explain why it's important that California's independence was if mhm. I want to explain why it's important that it matters that the California history matters for our independence movement, and I want to talk about also emphasize that in some respects it's not relevant because whether the international recognition should be one of the key goals, and maybe it might be the most. I think I can go so far to say I think it might be the most important goal for the independence movement. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think if France and Germany and Japan and Canada and Mexico or whatever decided, hey, it'd be a really good thing for us if California were independent, then I think that the state would just sort of tumble that direction. That's why I think it's so important that we sort of convince them that we've got a right to be independent, that the United States doesn't have a right to dominate us, and and that's why. And I'll explain about under international law, it would be upholding international law and not defeating international law in order to recognize California as an independent state. State, as I said, state. You'll see what I mean by state. Okay. First, International Law 100 is this. If you didn't know, all the land coastal areas of the world are divided between states. This is the real simple version of this, right? A state is an entity that holds a monopoly on force and violence within its territory. And states that don't have monopoly of force and violence in their territory, I think Iraq would be a good example with Kurdistan in the far north, that Iraqi government just doesn't seem to say anything about what's going on up north in northern India or Iraq. Don't forget, Kurdistan is one of the most orderly, peaceful, peaceful places in all of Iraq, but it's not under the Iraqi government. Somalia is the same. It's divided into like 5 different governments. Okay, that's a failed state. But also that any state that uses force and violence outside its borders risks international conflict. So that's the key thing about borders and states, is that within a state you can use violence. If you start using violence outside the state, or on high seas, or in other coastal waters of another country, you now have a potential for war. On the United Nations Charter, national border cannot be changed. This is what really made the United Nations unique in 1945 when it was organized. But to that point, states would go to war all the time, and they would go to war in order to change national borders, right? They're just border disputes, or Silesia, should Silesia be part of Germany or Austria? Should Alsace really be part of France or Germany? World War II, World War I were all based on these issues about Bosnia and different provinces and things that were in contest. The United Nations said that's all very well. The borders are where they are, and if you try to change them, you're violating the United Nations Charter. I think a real good recent example, maybe it's a long time ago now, is the 1991 invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. Kuwait was an independent country. Iraq claimed that Kuwait didn't really exist, but the rest of the world said it did. And George Bush organized, the Coalition of the Willing, and the Coalition of the Willing had some 40 countries in it. So it wasn't such a clear example. Also, as I said, Russia and is on the wrong side in Ukraine because that's Ukrainian territory. And even if the people there that's a good example. Because even if the people that in that part of Russia, part of Ukraine, that is supposedly wants to be part of Russia, want to be part of Russia, it has to be done with the consent of Ukraine. Oh, an example of that is Norway. If you didn't know, in 1905, until 1905, Norway was part of Sweden. And then what happened was the people of Norway voted to make Norway independent, and the people of Sweden voted to make Norway independent. And that's why, coming from Minnesota, I know all about this. One of the big holidays is the 15th of May, 15 de Mai. And 15 de Mai is the Norwegian Independence Day, because everyone celebrated it. And it was all done without a single shot being fired or anyone getting their nose broken over it. Oh. However, then there's the exception to the rule. The exception to the rule is decolonization. A colonized country does have the right to be independent under the United Nations. Okay, not the United Nations Charter, but of course what's sort of become international law. As we all know, now there's over 170 countries in the world, nation states, officially we call them states. 170 some states in the world. Some of them are as small as like Kiribati, you know. Smallest state in the Union world, you want to guess what it is?
Vatican City.
Yeah, you read it because you looked at the slides. Didn't you? Yeah, Vatican City is the smallest state in the world. It's like 100 acres. But it's still an independent country. Even though it doesn't have its own money, it doesn't have its own, doesn't have a border, it doesn't have any customs, it doesn't have anything. You just walk right into it any day you want, but it's an independent country.
What do we have in the world now that's colonized? I mean, are there still any colonizations?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? I mean, there are a lot of islands in the Caribbean that are still under some European or American government.
Puerto Rico, the UN still considers that colonized by America.
Yeah. But also the British Antilles, the Dutch Virgin, well, not the Dutch, the Dutch don't have the Virgin Islands anymore. No, I think they do have the Virgin Islands. Yeah, they're the Dutch, because we bought America. Virgin Island came from Denmark. That's right. Yeah, see what I mean? Yeah, France, Britain, United States, and the Dutch all have islands in the Caribbean. In the Pacific, same thing goes on there. I think you'd have to say Samoa and Guam, and are definitely still colonized. And then there's a bunch of uninhabited islands which don't have any people on them, which are in the United States territories.
So you're saying that under NATO, like Puerto Rico has the right to become its own state, its own nation, right?
Under international law, it would.
Yeah.
Like if they decide they really had enough of the United States.
So what would be the process that they would get their independence? Would they go to the international community? Or?
Well, the key I think to make mention is that a war for decolonization is therefore lawful. So if you can fight a war, then you can do anything else. Something hopefully will be less violent than a war.
But so if they want, like for example, again, Puerto Rico, if they wanted to do it peacefully, they would have to have the consent of the United States
Right.
to do so. Okay.
Right. And but of course, let's not forget the countries like Puerto Rico. Well, Puerto Rico is actually a different example. Well, their economy is weak, even though they have a lot of people. A lot of these countries have such small populations that there's really doubtful whether or not they'd ever be successful as an independent country. Right. Or they get an advantage because they get a lot of tourists because you'd say, if you're British, it's easier for you to go to Bermuda, because it's under British rule, isn't it?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. Now, next, this is 300. International law 300. The next lesson here is that national independence comes in two forms, not one. De jure and de facto. De jure means, that's what you think of as independence. It means literally by right. And that's what you think. De facto means that your government is reasonably, it's functioning reasonably well. It runs like an independent country, but it's not recognized. Taiwan being probably the most spectacular example of a de facto state. And don't forget, that state is so de facto that the United States of America has maintained a mutual defense agreement with them since about 1950. And the United States has used military force to protect Taiwan from invasion by China several times in the 40s and 50s. So, and yet it's not actually a recognized country. Or it's only recognized, that's the thing, there's a gray area because it's recognized by a few countries. It's not recognized in the United States, it's not recognized, but there are I think like 2 or 3 countries that recognize Taiwan. But Taiwan is actually lives in a world where China says, don't declare yourself independent, and we won't invade you, or something like that. Anyways. All right. So, international recognition in a nutshell. Nutshell is this. There are 2 ways states get recognized. One, because it's so damn obvious that the state exists, and there's no way to ignore it. Number 2 is simply when it's the interest of the state to recognize another state as its own. So, of course, Russia considers it useful to recognize Transnistria as a state.
Right.
Now the rest of the world doesn't, and that's why Transnistria is not considered a recognized state. But Russia recognizes it. Russia says it is a state.
Yeah. About Taiwan, I know there's been a couple times in the past 20 years when the United States has taken an aircraft carrier and inserted it between Taiwan and China.
Right.
Now that's not formal recognition of Taiwan, but it seems like there's a gray area there. So what's the perspective of the U.S. on Taiwan?
Well, actually, that's what you call freedom of navigation. There's a new video that just came out about the Corfu Channel crisis. I got primed up on this. And then one of the rules of international law is that a channel between two bodies of water is considered international waters. There's freedom of navigation across those. So what the Navy is doing is saying, see, we have the right to to sail that channel between China and Taiwan, and we just did it. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's an interesting distinction. I think Taiwan is fascinating. So it seems like, I mean, the U.S. doesn't have, I think, official diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but they're also saying, as far as we're concerned, this is not an internal Chinese water.
Right.
This is
Well, that's just it. It wouldn't matter because in the Corfu crisis is a good example. Corfu is an island that's officially owned by Greece, but the other side of the water is Albania. And way back around 1950, Albania claimed that ships could not go through their waters, their side of the channel, if you will, because they said it wasn't, and Great Britain, actually said no, it doesn't matter because it's international channel, and so even though they recognize the Albanian waters, they still insist on the right to travel through it. Okay. That's that. I should point out, by the way, that one of the many conventions the United States of America does not subscribe to is the Law of the Sea, which is an international convention on the law of the sea, and which we probably should. And I won't say that.
So
Chalk one more thing up when I talk about things that if you ask me what independent California would recognize would be the Law of the Sea.
So you're saying the U.S. right now, there are waters that if you cross those waters, then you're, for the U.S., you're treading on their territory?
Yeah, but the question is whether or not they have a right to stop you or sort of tax you or anything like that. Now, don't forget, if you're running drugs or something like that, that's different. So they have it's as many things in international law, it's a gray area, but you have the right to free travel across those things. Persian Gulf between between Oman and Iran, right? The Strait of Hormuz. That's another very, very important piece of international water, and I'm sure if you maybe somewhere in the middle, I don't know how wide the strait is, right? But you think about any piece of water that's less than six miles apart is going to have some piece of it. It's going to, you know what I mean? There's not going to be any international water in the middle of that.
Is there a distance that
Actually 12 miles.
12 miles, basically 12 miles off the coast?
Yeah, it used to be 3 miles. It's now 12 miles.
Off the coast of the U.S.
Or any other
that
country.
would be considered you're coming into U.S. waters.
Right.
China, same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And they would have the right to possibly send ships and declare.
So let's put it this way, yeah,
hostile-
if you were sailing 12 miles off the shore of any country, you could expect to have a visit from the Coast Guard. But it'd be a friendly visit, like, what are you doing here, and, you know, whatever, maybe. You know, are you carrying contraband or something like that? But just to be stopped just because we don't allow it, because you're not from our country, that's not going to be permitted. Okay. So that's sort of the thing. Yeah, an English Channel probably is a good example of that, right? Because that thing is not really right.
Yeah.
Territorial waters of England, territorial waters of France would meet in the middle, and so there's
So
no.
that's international.
That's international waters. Any country can sail between England and France, right?
Well, and there's, I mean, this is not relevant. Are we recording this?
Yeah, we are, but it doesn't
Okay,
matter.
well,
Yeah, it's for references.
I think it's interesting how, like, with Brexit, which I see a lot of parallels with CALEXIT, just as far as the technical aspects of it, how already people are saying that it's going to lead to, like, one of the first things that's going to happen if UK leaves the EU is you're going to have these conflicts between British and French fishing vessels in the Danish.
Oh yeah, economic
I
use
don't
of
know
water
what
is a
they,
whole nother
what
subject.
they
Yeah,
extract, but,
yeah, we're talking about navigation as opposed to economic.
Mhm.
And the economic exclusive zone though goes 200 miles.
200 miles.
Yeah, that's the reason why. And then there's this about the continental shelf and all that. That's the reason why, you know, the United States of America can be licensing oil exploration out in the deep sea because of the 200-mile limit. Another big one though is Ecuador, because they have their 200-mile limit goes way out into some of the most important fishing grounds, right, off their coast. So it goes. Yeah, if you want an example of a country that took a long time to be recognized, with the USSR. Soviet Union was not recognized by the United States until 1933. That was about at least 11 years after it was established.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And the reason was because the Roosevelt administration thought it'd be a good idea, it'd be good for the economy of the United States, and also they thought maybe recognizing USSR would be good. Maybe they'd help us with Japan, you know. And this is before World War II. So they for the United States' reasons, said Franklin Roosevelt, it'd be good to recognize USSR. So but that was 1933. So, you know, and of course, another one is Communist China. The United States didn't recognize China for almost 30 years after, over 20, right? And they took over in 49 and they didn't get recognized until 72.
Wow.
72, 73.
China's clearly a country, everybody gets it, but on paper, America says, we don't see you as a country, and so technically they didn't have that recognition, right? That's the key of being international.
Right. And when it became recognized, they also gained the seat on the Security Council of the United Nations, because it took over Taiwan's seat. Well, of course, at the time it was nationalist China.
So what's the criteria for one state or one nation to recognize the other? It's just arbitrary? I mean,
Yeah, it's pretty arbitrary.
It's arbitrary.
It's arbitrary, although, like I said, it can become just simply, we can't go on like this.
Right.
You know, like I said, you know, an example, you know, like I talked about with Soviet Union, you know, the United States just decided it wasn't in the United States' interest to continue on. You just couldn't
China.
pretend that there was no government in Russia. Right. The United States did not recognize Albania for a long time either, but remember we were younger. The passport would say not good for travel to Cuba and Albania or North Korea.
I don't remember that.
I know, I got a U.S. passport that says that, and those three countries are listed in my passport. It says not good for travel to Albania, Cuba, or North Korea. So we didn't recognize Albania for a long, long time, and the reason was, the reason, but I'm saying you could get away with it because Albania is very small. USA doesn't do much trade with Albania.
Right.
Like, who the hell cares? A bunch of, you know,
Does Greece, I don't think they recognize Albania as a...
I think now they do, because they have to, because Albania is now a member of NATO. I didn't know that.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, they're a member of NATO, and they're trying to get in the European Union. So they're now normalized. Okay, Well, now let's back to us. We're Free California, or as a Pacific Federation. Again, for if you didn't know, it's my position that the ultimate goal should be a federation of Western states, and which I like to call Pacifica. And then also that include the U.S. territories, because once you hit the West Coast, you might as well take all the U.S. territories as well. Samoa, Guam, and Wake Island. And then there's the U.S. Trust territories, which maybe like to become states as well. If you didn't know that. Micronesia, Palau, you ever heard of these countries? Yeah, they were formerly U.S. trust territories. They became independent, but the United States has a special relationship with them, which allows those people to travel the USA without passports.
So I think this is a really interesting point. I'd like to
Yeah.
to get your opinion on this. So there's my introduction to I guess separatism in North America came about when I was living in Cascadia. And there's a strong sense of bioregionalism, that that's a distinct region, that has its own culture and so on. And I think that Cascadia and California have a lot in common. The problem, a problem, one of many problems here, is that a lot of Cascadians do not see themselves as Californians. Especially, there's people who have left California to Cascadia. It's a different place.
I know.
It's a different place. If you had a federation, and that federation was democratic, it would be basically a California ruled.
No, it wouldn't. I don't think it has to be.
So I'm curious, do you see it as like a monetary union, a political union? Like, what's the?
I
could
think,
see having a currency.
I think, believe it or not, what would work, because you're absolutely right. I looked it up. If you join California, Washington, Oregon just together, and throw in Hawaii for the fun of it, and Alaska, that's 45 million people. 39 million of those people will be Californians. Okay? You got a problem here. I think that my answer to that is that, believe it or not, the Articles of Confederation of the United States, I think, would be a good model. Where, in other words, you would have a national government that would be as small and weak as humanly possible, as we can get away with. And that each state would have an independent voice on that, but that it would have as little power as possible.
Would it be able to issue debt?
Maybe not.
Because this is one of the issues with the EU, is that there's no such thing as a euro bond. There's
Okay.
German bonds and French bonds. And
Yeah,
so
well, that
on.
may be the
There's
real
not-
aim. Yeah.
There's not a euro equivalent of a treasury bond. And that allows each country to kind of rise and fall independently, but then Greece has had problems, Portugal has problems, because the euro rises,
Right.
because Germany is very strong. But then
Well, first thing I
Greece
would
is still
say
having a
that
problem with
I
it.
see no reason why we wouldn't actually maintain the United States dollar as long as the United States dollar is managed in a appropriate way. I think that that's my opinion. That I think also that if all the states officially were independent and could manage their own foreign policies by themselves, then I think it would ultimately be a California policy anyways. That they would just sort of come to follow California because the world would treat them that way. It'd be like, we're going to listen to California because you're just, I'm sorry, Washington State, or Oregon, you're just too small. And that's not an offensive thing. That's just the facts. But I think we also learn to get along with each other because you're right. I think we have a lot to share, and I don't think we have that much to argue about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the foreign policy, my guess is probably more coherent than the internal policies. Like, I see it more as.
Also, there's also the North American with Canada, especially in defense. It's a good example of defense, right? Because after all, United States Navy really needs Bremerton, Washington, right? Because that's where all the ballistic missile submarines are. That would have to be presumably remain United States Navy base. But don't forget, that's not that big a deal because Canada is a partner of the United States of America. That American ships use Canadian bases, Canadian ships use American bases. I also know that Yokosuka in Japan is United States ships there, Canada ships are there, Japan ships are there. So, therefore, I think from the perspective of defense, I don't see it being impossible as long as we get along pretty well. you know, I only believe, frankly, my only concern would be that someone like some extreme American president after independence would decide that he would get political popular by threatening California. That's the only thing but I think a sensible United States government would recognize that, you know,
Like the one we have right now.
well,
Exactly.
yeah, exactly. But I mean, let's not forget, as long as we maintain that defense posture, that we'd have California generals and California admirals would be talking to American generals and American admirals, right? So it would be getting along. I mean, don't forget, California already has 2 National Guards, right? We have the National Guard, and then we have a National Guard, and then we have the military reserve.
Right. So question on the central small government that you're saying, which basically
Like passports
was the
and
initial
postage, and the most uncontroversial
the initial
things.
thing for the Confederate States. But what kind of would we put in our own new constitution?
Well, the article, I do believe that the American California Constitution is a mess. I can't see it being an independent country's constitution. You ever seen the thing? See, the trouble is, every time somebody passed a proposition, it wound up in the Constitution. And they didn't put it in the beginning, at the end, like the American Constitution. They stuck it somewhere in the front. And so you have to page through that thing over page after page after page until you find the actual stuff, like, how big is the state assembly? How do you get to be a state senator? The most basic stuff that, frankly, the 1849 Constitution was so much better organized than the 77 Constitution.
So you're saying we would have to start a constitution from scratch with all the Pacific Rim states or whoever.
No. The federation would be a federation. I mean, the Articles of Confederation was the only. Go look it up. It's the actual agreement from the 13 colonies, and there's a good model for
We
the fact.
could use that.
I'd use it as that. Yeah, it provided.
There's also a reason why the Articles of Confederation didn't work.
Yeah, it didn't work. It didn't work because the other countries started using trade against each other as one big one. But for instance, I didn't know this, but before the Revolutionary War, all the colonies had offices in Europe, actually in Britain. So they already had a sort of an embassy system.
That's because of the nature of how the colonies were founded.
Right.
Pretty much every southern colony was founded on the basis of companies
Right.
and extracting of any resources. They were founded searching for gold, and that's why their offices. It just makes sense to have their offices
In London.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I mean, that wouldn't describe Massachusetts or anything like that, but they still maintain an office, sort of like a trade mission in London to conduct business with, at that time, all the countries that mattered, which was Europe. But they weren't allowed to have, I guess Great Britain didn't allow them to have missions outside of Great Britain because that was part of the colonial thing. But in other words, so there's your model, that you could have each state choosing to have its own mission or choosing to go along with some common mission or something like that. I'm just sort of optimistic that, the states, which all have the same basic political views and would agree to, get along.
The rest of the 49 states.
No, if you want to know, I think the ideal federation is 11 states, and I'll name them for you. It goes something in this order. It goes California, Washington, Oregon. It goes Hawaii, because Hawaii is extremely democratic, and others is that once you bring in Hawaii depends on California, physically, okay? Once you bring in Washington, you get Alaska. Then you get in Nevada, because Nevada is already being very liberal. Then look at Colorado and New Mexico. New Mexico is more democratic than California is. Now, once you got all those states in, then Utah falls in there because Utah is turning blue. And then you get Arizona, because now Arizona is not only turning blue, but it's now surrounded by a whole bunch of countries by non-U.S. states. And the last I throw in there is Idaho. And the reason why I throw in Idaho is because I know Eastern Washington. And I know that you can't run Spokane without Coeur d'Alene, and you can't run Walla Walla without Moscow.
And you probably, I don't know if you could run Boise without Salt Lake City. because
Yeah, exactly.
The Mormons are very strong.
Yeah, and then also I-84 goes up through that area, right? But you can leave out Montana. You can leave out Montana because there's an actual mountain range between most of Idaho and Montana.
And there's an interesting history of autonomy there with the Mormons and Deseret, the country
Yeah, right.
that they had going pretty well until they discovered gold. The feds are like, that's actually ours, we're making this a state, and so on. But I think there's definitely, within the Mormon community, there definitely is some support for the idea of autonomy and self.
Well, I think it has to do with the fact that, no, I'm thinking about the fact that Salt Lake is like California. They've got a growing technical, tech field, tech business, and they're interested in foreign trade and things like that. That's, that's, remember, the 4th Congressional District of Utah is now Democratic. That's Salt Lake City. So you thought Utah was totally blue, totally red, and it's not. Got a,
I'm sorry.
yeah, absolutely.
But so I'm gonna say this. I'm probably gonna get some rejection. What about a state like Massachusetts?
Well, I've thought about that, and I sort of, frankly, I think to myself is that Nebraska and Iowa make the sort of the line that draws between the Midwest / Northeast. But don't forget, the Northeast now includes Virginia and maybe includes North Carolina. And then maybe includes Georgia, maybe includes Florida. I don't know. I think what I'm trying to say is what you might call, I like to call for joking purposes, Jesus land, is basically rural Dixie and the northern Great Plains. And
so you're basically dividing then the West with the East, basically, as far as the physical border, we're basically putting in all the western states you said up to a certain point, and then.
Well, let's put it this way: if you combine the Northeast, going all the way down to Virginia, which is, as you know, turning pretty solidly blue now, right? If you include that, include Illinois, you include Minnesota, which is not that big a population. You could call Wisconsin, let's just say Minnesota and Illinois. You'd have to throw in Wisconsin too.
No.
And then with the 11.
Nah.
And the 11.
Then we're recreating the United States.
Well, no, the point is you do. No, it's no joke. I was about to tell you. If you added all those states in plus the 11 states I mentioned, that's about 70% of the American population. United States population. But that's okay because that's 70% now under a new constitution that isn't the one we've got.
Yeah,
It
but
doesn't
it's
have-
too big. It's the problem with the U.S. is become too big. I mean, I think
No.
to govern.
I don't
Such a
think
huge-
actually that's the problem. The real problem is the Constitution gives too much power to states that are socially conservative, and gives too much power to social conservatives, basically.
But do you think that can be changed?
Or
is it a fundamental flaw?
yes, it's a fundamental flaw. Maybe that's what I was talking about earlier. Remember what I'd said earlier about
Because so far it just sounds like we keep switching DC for Sacramento and all that.
well, it's just fine with me.
I wouldn't.
Here, remember this back to this? Remember what I said there? I told Marcus, I said, I'd see it as an analogy to, we all know the 3 things that make for a fire? Right? We're all told this is in school, right? This is how you have a fire, this is how you stop a fire. Right? Fuel, oxygen, heat. Right? If you take any of those 3, you don't get a fire, right? You can stop a fire. Well, I think the same thing goes on in a way. We got 3 problems. We got a Republican Party that's decided that white supremacy is their policy. Because 2, we have a constitution that basically rewards the Republican Party to support white supremacy. And 3, we got a California that can't tolerate that. So, and I saw, and also 3, we have 3.5, we got a world, U.S. allies, who are frightened and terrified that the Republican Party is, becoming this authoritarian, racist entity. And they feel that their security is threatened. Because, of course, nothing else, I mean, let's not face it, for one thing, we know that right-wing Europeans use right-wing Americans as models and spokespeople, right?
That's usually been the way since Hitler.
Unfortunately, yeah, right. There's the pattern of Hitler, right? But I mean, the guy who shot all those